In this lecture, we are going to build the feature section of our website. And so what you're going to learn here is how and why to create grids inside of grids, how to create a responsive component without media queries, and again, you already know this last part, so we did that already in the intro section, but again, this time we're going to do it in a real-world scenario. And then finally, we will build even a very small component using the power of CSS Grid. And so we're going to start with this part here of the website, so the feature section, as I was saying. Now I chose to go with this first because it's a lot more simple than this section here actually, so the header or the realtors. So this one here is easier, and so that's perfect to get started with this page. And we will then come back to this top part here and do it later, okay? So what we have here are basically 6 features laid out in a 2x3 grid. So 3 columns and 2 rows. And so this is of course a perfect use case for using CSS Grid. So let's again start doing that in our markup. Okay, and let's actually close all of these SAS files here and then start with our markup. So here in the features section. So let's again use Emmet in order to place 6 features here. So we're going to call each of these simply feature. And now let me show you something else with Emmet. So in the CodePen lectures, I already showed you that we can use this $ here to number stuff. But we can also use Emmet to introduce some text into the HTML element right off the bat. So and for that, we just have to use the curly brackets. And so let's say that we want to number these features from 1 to 6. So in each of them, we want to say feature and then the number, and then we multiply it by 6. And that's it. So each of them is now called feature, and then the text in there will say feature 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so for now we don't have all the content inside of each of these features, like I showed you in the demo, but just some text so that we can lay out our grid actually. So let's open our feature SAS file and start writing some code. So this features element here is a grid item, right? But now we want this grid item to also be a grid container. And so that's just the same thing as we have in Flexbox, where a flex item can easily become a flex container. So all we have to do is to write display grid, and that's it. So right now, this features element is a grid container. Now it would be really helpful and great to have something called a subgrid here. And that's actually something that's coming to CSS Grid in the second level of the specification. But right now, subgrids are not available. So what will a subgrid actually be? So basically, it will allow a grid that is inside a grid, so like in this case here, to like snap its tracks to the parent grid. For example, align its columns with the columns of the parent grid. So in this example, we could then make it so that the columns of this small grids would automatically be where the columns of our overall page layout are. Right? Does that make sense? And actually that would be really helpful here. But right now that's just not possible. And so we need to manually create new columns for this grid container. So just to show you what I mean with the subgrid, so it would be like creating a grid where we could automatically say that one column should be like these 2 columns here from the parent grid, okay? So basically snapping to these tracks. But right now, again, that's not possible, and so we're just gonna manually create our grid, right? So let's start with the columns. Grid template columns. And remember, we want 3 columns here, and so we just say 3 columns with 1 fractional unit each. And that's it. That's 3 equally sized columns right there. Now about the rows, we don't actually need to specify anything for the rows. I mean, we could do it, and we would do it basically like this. So grid template rows, and then we could just say auto and auto, but that's not necessary at all, because that's just what's gonna happen anyway if you don't define anything at all. And so we don't need this. What actually will happen is that we create an implicit grid then, right? So all of our items will basically be placed in an implicit grid and not in an explicit grid, because we don't define the rows. So we have like 0 cells defined for our grid. But that's not a problem at all. It works just the same. So let's get rid of this. and then we're good to go. And actually, let's take a look at that so that you can see that's actually true. And here we go. So we have now feature 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and 6 all laid out like in our demo. And we can also see that here in the DevTools quite well. So let's select this one here, and then it will deselect our overall grid, right? So we can either have this one or this one. And so down here now you see our grid, so our 3x2 grid. And you see that the line here is dotted, and as I explained to you before, that means that these are row tracks of an implicit grid. Now the next step is to actually get rid of this huge font size here and the padding that we gave this here just for testing purposes, and then get rid of the background color and also add some margin to the top and bottom of this overall parent element. Okay, so let's do that. And I'm going to put it here before the grid stuff definition. So margin, and I want 15 rem on top and on the bottom. And let's get rid of the background color as well. Then in the base, let's also delete this. And so that should look a lot more natural now. All right, so we can also add, of course, a gap here, which we haven't done yet. And let's set it to 60 pixels. So 6 rem. All right. And yeah, so that's better. And so now we're ready to start filling this up with the actual content. So what do we have here actually for the content? Let's take a look at that. And so here we see that we have like this icon here, and that comes from an SVG icon sprite that I already included in our image folder. Okay, so this time we're not going to go through manually creating that SVG sprite like we did in the last project, because right now you already know how to do that. And so I did it so that we can just use it and don't waste any time doing that, right? So we have the icon, then we have like this heading here, and then after that the paragraph with this text. Now this heading here, you see that it has this different font size than this one here, right? So remember that I said in the beginning that this font size here is like for the usual text, for the normal text, and then for the headings we have like this different font family. And these ones here are actually H4 elements. And so I decided that these smaller headings are the H4s. So this one, for example, and also this one, these are H4s. Then this one, slightly bigger, is the H3. This one here, of course, is the H1. And then we also have this one, which is the H2. Okay, so I could have done that differently, but that's just up to you how you do it in your project. So that's the hierarchy that I defined for the headings. So an SVG icon, an H4, and a paragraph with this text. So back in our index.html, let's then get rid of this text here and start including the stuff here. So we start with the icon, and remember how we did that. So use the SVG element, and I'm going to call this one feature icon. And then in there, remember that we have this weird use element. So let me actually write that out. And then we use xlink :href. Okay, and then image, and it's simply called sprite as before. And then in here, we have the different icons. And this one is called icon global. And so that's the one that looks like that globe. And let me actually show that to you. So image and sprite. So you cannot really see the image, but we can see the different names. So we have icon presentation or icon heart full, icon expand, icon lock, trophy, key, and so on and so forth. And you could probably open this also in some kind of a graphical software in order to take a look at these different icons here. But I'm not going to do that because I really just want to quickly get my content into here. Okay, so next we have the H4 element, and this one is called heading 4, very simply. And so you see that I'm already using like a reusable style, and so this is like a component that I'm going to reuse throughout the page later on, right? And so that's not really part of the feature block here and the feature component itself. So, world's best luxury homes. So that's the heading for the first one. And then we have, of course, the feature text. Okay, and as for this content, here in the image folder, you will see a small text file. And so in here, I have the text for these 6 elements. Okay, so let's take a look at that. And all right, we have our icon, we have our unstyled H4 and the P. So that's huge right now, but of course, we're going to take care of that later. For now, let's actually just copy this here 5 times. Replace this one here. This was just for testing purposes, but now we just have this content. And so we just have to replace then the stuff here. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think 1 is missing, yeah. And okay. So the next one is called the trophy. It says then here, only the best properties. And let's get our text. Of course, we could leave the same text here for all of these elements, but then it would look weird and not natural at all. And also I want to show you something that happens when we have different amounts of text here, okay? And so it's really useful to have it like this. Okay, next up we have to replace the global in here, change it to map pin, and here it says all homes in top locations. And then let's get the text again. This here is key. New home in 1 week. And only 2 to go. So this one is presentation. Top 1% realtors. And finally, this one is with a lock, and it says secure payments on Nexter, so the name of the company. Let's take a look. And here we go. Okay, so that is our content ready to be styled. And we're actually going to do that right in the next lecture. This is the second part of building the features section. So this is where we left off after the last lecture. And so now it's time to actually style these icons, this heading, and the paragraph. And after we're done doing that, we will then lay them out here in this way. So the icon here on this side, and then these 2, one after the other. Okay, but let's start by styling these 3. So we have the icon and the text, and then the heading separately. So we have features, and then we have the feature. So this feature component here would, in theory, be reusable in another page. So it's completely independent from the features class. But I still put them in the same file though, because they are closely related. And having these classes in different files would make me jump around a lot through the different files. And that would be terrible for recording videos like this. Okay, and so basically each of the section now got its own file. And then there I have the overall element, which is like the container of these components. But again, these feature here would be completely reusable somewhere else later on the page, or if I had another page on my website. Okay, so let's style the icon. And then let's also style the text. Okay, and actually let's start with the text. Let's set the font size to 1.7 rem. And that's it. So actually we don't have to do anything else, just increasing the font size here a bit. Then as for the icon, let's change the color. And remember how we do that with SVG icons. So what we have to do is to use the fill property. And then we use the primary color. So color primary. And so that's our golden color here again. And then finally, let's just size it. So we want a width of 45 pixels, so 4.5 rem, and then the same for the height. So that's usually the same. Okay, and now finally, we also want to style the heading 4. And that's going to be in the typography file. And so, heading 4. And we will then also later have the heading 1, 2, 3, and 4. So let me actually do all of them here. Why not? So 1, 2, 3, and then 4 here. All right. So we want them to have the font family that I mentioned before, which is this one here. Oh, sorry. Now I close it. So we want the font display. So it's Josephine Sans. And that's the one that we're going to use for all of the headings. So it is font display. And we also want the font weight to be 400. And remember, we actually included that font weight in the HTML from Google Fonts, okay? Now, we actually want all of these to have these two properties. And so that's a perfect use case for a CSS extend, right? So we can do like this placeholder that I showed you a long time ago, I think. We haven't really used it since then, but now it's a good time to use it again. So we use this placeholder, which I'm simply going to call heading. Then I put this here. And now all I have to do is to extend all of these like this. So I say extend and heading. And that's it. And so what's going to happen now is that basically this heading 1 here is copied like to this place here. So let's copy this all over the place here. And so what's going to happen now, it's like as if this heading 1, heading 2, heading 3, and heading 4 will be copied here to this selector. All right. So it's not a mix-in because the mix-in works the other way around. So with the mix-in, this code here would then be pasted into each of the selectors. And with an extend, it works the other way around. So basically, these selectors are copied into a huge selector, which then makes this code here apply to all of them, right? So anyway, we were talking about the heading 4, and here the font size, we want it to be 1.9 rem. Now, remember that I told you that we want to use this heading 4 in different situations throughout the page, okay? So we want to use it here on these features, but also this one here is an H4 as well. And you see that this one is white and this one is dark. And so let's actually do that with a modifier class, okay? So let's add a modifier class, 1 for light, and the color here is going to be gray light 1, okay? And then we will have dark, and that's going to be gray dark 1. And actually it's here. And so, all right. Let's just duplicate this. And so this one is for dark. Now we of course have to add this here to the HTML as well. And so let's add multiple cursors here in each of them, so we don't have to write it once. So heading 4, and this one is the dark version. Okay, so the modifier is with these 2 dashes. All right, and I think that's actually it. So let's check it out in our page. And that already looks quite good, right? So this icon here has the correct size, and all of this looks just like we have it here. Okay, now all we have to do is to actually align these elements like we have it here. And how are we going to do that? Well, once again, we are going to use CSS Grid here, because why not? This is just a small component, and we actually have a 2-dimensional layout here, right? So let's take a look. So this is actually 2-dimensional. So we have the row axis and the column axis. And so it's really 2-dimensional, and so why not use a CSS Grid for doing that? So we will have a 2x2 grid, and let me show it to you here actually already. And that's not the one, but that's the one. So we're going to have this 2x2 grid, And then in there, we will place these 3 elements. Okay, does that make sense? So typography is done for now. And so this feature here, which itself is a grid item, of course, will now also become a grid container. And so we have a grid inside a grid inside a grid. So just like we had in Flexbox, we can really nest the grids really deep. So display grid, and let's start by defining the columns. Grid template columns. And so what width do we want to have for the first column? So the first column will contain the icon. And we already know the width of the icon, so it's 4.5 rem. And so in this column here, we could simply put 4.5 rem as well, right? But instead of doing that, we will simply put auto. Okay, or we could use min content or max content. So let's actually use min content. Why not? Because this way, if we eventually wanted to change the width here of the icon, then automatically the width of this first column would adjust without us having to change anything. And then the rest of the grid, so the second column, will simply occupy the rest. Okay, simple as that. Okay, makes sense? And now as for the rows, again, we don't really need to specify them, because all we want to happen is them to be the size of the content. And so once more, we don't really define them. And probably you start to see this emerging like as a trend. So many times we don't really define the rows, we just define the columns. And in a real world scenario, that's actually many times the case. So many times we just want the content to define the rows. And so in that case, it's not really necessary to define the rows. We will have other cases where we will define the rows, and you're going to see that later. But for now, it's good like this. It works perfectly fine like this. So let's check it out. And we'll see that it's actually not really perfect yet. Okay, so let's check out what's happening here. And so let's inspect this. And so here you see our 4 grid cells. So the first one is actually larger, much larger than the icon. And that's because right now we only have 3 elements in this grid. And so the third one, of course, because of the auto placement algorithm, gets placed here under this icon. So what we could do here is to place this grid item here in this grid cell. But actually what's even better is to make this grid cell here span all the way here until the end, so that we end up with this grid area here for this icon. Because right now, this row here is also as high as this icon. But actually we just want it to be as large, as high as this text here. And so if we had all of this column here, so these 2 rows for this icon, then that would actually happen perfectly fine. So let me show that to you. So the icon, we wanted to have the grid row property set to start at number 1 all the way to the end, or span 2. So in this case, it's really the same. We could just add -1, and then we're sure that it goes all the way until the end. And so automatically now, the text should get placed here to the end. And for some reason, that didn't really happen. And so this is actually a good opportunity to tell you something important that I didn't tell you yet, I think. So this -1 here, this means not the end of the grid, but the end of the explicit grid, okay? And so this would be the last explicit grid line, but we didn't really define any grid rows, right? And so there's not really an explicit grid. And so this -1 here doesn't make much sense. So instead of this -1, we should simply add span 2, okay? Makes sense? So again, the -1 only works with an explicit grid, but we had an implicit grid because we didn't define the rows. And so it didn't work as expected. Right now it does. Okay, and so let's inspect it here as well. So it doesn't really highlight here the spanning going on, but it doesn't matter because we can see it by ourselves, because you see that this icon here is actually already in this second cell. And so this is like all the same cell. Actually, I think if you hover it here, then you will see it. Well, not really, but again, that's not a huge problem. So we're almost done here now. What we need now is, of course, some spacing here. So add some space between the columns and the rows. And that's very simple, of course. So just add a grid row gap, and let's make it 1.5 rem, and then a gap for the column as well. So grid column gap. And this one is 2.5 rem. Okay, so let's check it out again. And all right, here we go. That looks really good already. Just a couple of things that we need to change here. So first of all, in our demo project, these icons here are actually a bit moved to the top. So basically to center the center of the icon here with the text. And that's just something that we have to do manually, okay? And so let's fix that. So we're very simply just going to translate the icon a bit to the top. So transform and translate in the Y direction, just -1 rem. Okay, and so that should fix that. Yeah, so that looks a bit more natural now. And now the second issue is that you see in these two columns, where we only have 3 lines of text, that the space here is huge. Okay, so I mentioned before that I wanted to have different text in the different elements, and that's because I wanted to show you how we can fix exactly this issue. So let's actually inspect it. So we want this one here now. And so you can see that this row here is larger than the row in here and in here, right? And so why is this happening? Well, it's happening because this features grid here, which contains these 6 grid items, makes it so that these grid items, that all of the grid items fill the entire grid cells, right? And so that's because of the align items property that is by default set to stretch. Remember that? So align items is the property that controls the alignment of grid items along grid cells. And so these here are the grid items of this features grid. And currently this align items property is set to stretch. So what do we do if we want all of them here to start at the top? So basically move all of this here to the top. Well, we just have to set the align items property on this parent container here to start. So let's do that. And so this here is the grid container. And so align items, let's set it to start. Okay, and if we're back now, that is how it looks like. So we could maybe even give this here like a background color, but actually that's not even necessary. Because even with this inspector here, you can see that this grid item is now no longer the exact same of the grid cell, but just the size of its content moved all the way to the top, just as we specify at the grid container. Of course, we could also set this like to end. Let me show you how that would look like. And yeah, so then it would move these 2 here, which are smaller than the other items. It would move them simply to the end, so to the bottom of their grid cell. Or we could try center also. All right, and so now it's centered, but that's still not what we want. We just want them to be at the start. Okay, and so it's really important that you are aware that all of these properties that I showed you in the first section, so in the intro section, that all of these properties exist and what they do and how you can use them to your advantage to achieve exactly what you need to achieve. Okay, and so in this case, we really needed the align items to move all of this up to the top, so up the column axis. All right, and so right now it actually looks the exact same as our demo. There's just one small thing to fix, because when you reduce this here, what you see that it gets narrower and narrower and even more narrow. So what we want to do here, of course, is what I showed you in the last section, which is basically to make this responsive without writing a single line of media query. Okay, and so that's what happens here. So as you see, at some point, well, the text gets smaller, and that's because of media query, but that's not what I'm talking about. So what happens is that at some point, you see that it moves down here. And so instead of a 3x2 grid, we now have a 2x3. Okay, and then as it gets even smaller, it does basically a 1x6 grid. Okay, and so that's what we want to achieve, and that's quite simple actually, and even without media queries. So do you remember how we did that? Well, all we have to change here is this grid template columns and define some new column tracks. So grid template columns. So do you remember what the trick here is? Well, first of all, we need to use the autofit keyword in here. And remember what autofit does? It simply creates as many tracks as can fit based on the width that we define. okay? And so this width that we define here will be with the minmax function. So minmax, and we say that the width should always stay between 25 rem and 1 fractional unit. And that's as simple as it. And actually I said 25. Okay, so 250 pixels basically. So again, the width of each of the tracks should always stay between 250 rem and 1 fractional unit. And based on this, CSS will add as many tracks as fit in the container. Okay, so that's exactly what we did in one of the demo examples in the last section. So let's check it out if it works. So where's the container? Okay, so we start with the 1120 pixels, and so let's move it down now. And remember that each column can have up to 250 pixels. So we start decreasing, and then, bam, you see at this point, it no longer could fit 3 columns, and so it reduced it to 2 columns. Okay, so let's check it out here. So you see this feature here as 251, which is almost the minimum size that it has to have. So you see it now, bam. So 250, and a bit less will push it off the edge and bring it down to 2 column tracks. Okay, so that's really amazing. That's really great and powerful. And now you see that it's even more important to use this align items set to start that I had before. For example, now here you have a lot of empty space down here, and so it's really important that you see that if we inspect this here, so the size of the item is just this, and so without the align items set to start, it would look really weird. Okay, so this works just the way I explained before, and everything is working. Of course, we could change this 250 pixels to something else, but I found that it works really well in this particular situation. Okay, and so we're actually done with this section. So we used 2 grids here, so one big grid which could fit all of these 6 items here. So 1 grid item for each feature, and then each feature is a grid container itself, which then itself contains these 3 grid items. So the icon, this H4, and this text. And grid allows us to nest as many grids inside of each other, and that is very helpful to create even very small 2-dimensional layouts like this one. So we could have used like Flexbox for this one here as well, but then we would have to mess like with margins. We would have added a margin to the bottom of this here, for example, or the top of the text, and that would have added some extra complexity that is not really necessary if we can use CSS Grid. Okay, so grids don't only work for the big layout parts like some people say, but they can also be for very small components as long as they are 2-dimensional. Then it makes a lot of sense using grids for that. Okay, so next up we're going to build this part here. Okay, so yeah, stay tuned for that.